The throne room reeked of iron and decay. King Maximilian III convulsed on the marble floor, foam tinged with blood frothing from his lips as his fingers clawed at his own throat. His eyes, those distinctive violet eyes that marked the royal bloodline, rolled back until only the whites showed. The court physician stood frozen, helpless, as the young king's body contorted in ways that defied nature. His spine arched backward until bones cracked audibly, and when he finally screamed, it wasn't human, it was the shriek of something ancient and wrong. This was how the last heir of the Aurelian dynasty died, choking on his own blood while courtiers fled in terror. This was the final payment for a sin committed 3 centuries earlier. But this curse didn't begin in a throne room. It began with love, or what 2 people convinced themselves was love. Before the madness, before the deformities that would plague generations, before children murdered their parents and brothers tore out each other's eyes, there were simply 2 brilliant souls who believed their blood was too precious to dilute. King Aurelian the Magnificent and his sister Lysandra were considered the golden children of their age. Poets wrote of Aurelian's wisdom, generals praised his strategic mind, and architects marveled at the cities he designed. Lysandra was his equal in every way, a mathematician who solved theorems that had puzzled scholars for decades, a linguist who spoke 12 languages, a woman whose beauty was said to make the moon itself grow dim with envy. Together they were going to forge an empire that would last 1,000 years. Together they would keep their bloodline pure and powerful. Together they would defy both gods and men. How did a love that began with whispered promises in moonlit gardens transform into a hereditary curse that would see infants born with scales instead of skin? What drove 2 of history's most brilliant minds to commit an act so abhorrent that it would poison their descendants for centuries? How many innocents would pay the price for their twisted ambition? The Aurelian Empire at its height controlled half the known world. From the frozen wastes of the north to the burning deserts of the south, Aurelian's banner, a golden sun pierced by a silver sword, flew over 100 cities. The empire had been built by Aurelian's grandfather through brutal conquest, maintained by his father through shrewd diplomacy, and was meant to be perfected by Aurelian himself. The royal bloodline was considered divine, descended from the sun god Heir himself, or so the priests claimed. This divinity manifested in certain traits: the violet eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone, the peculiar resistance to disease that kept royals healthy while plagues decimated their subjects, and most importantly the gift, an almost supernatural ability to command loyalty and inspire both love and fear in equal measure. These traits, the royal family believed, were diluted each time they married outside their bloodline. Aurelian's own parents were second cousins, a practice that raised few eyebrows in a court where preserving divine blood was paramount. But Aurelian and Lysandra would take this practice to its ultimate, horrific conclusion. The signs were there from the beginning had anyone dared to look. Servants whispered about finding the siblings in compromising embraces. Lysandra's suitors met mysterious ends. One fell from a balcony, another choked on a fishbone at a state dinner, a third simply vanished while traveling to meet her. Aurelian refused match after match with foreign princesses, claiming none were worthy of the throne. The royal physician, an elderly man named Gavril who had delivered both siblings, noticed troubling changes in their behavior. He wrote in his private journal about finding them in the palace laboratories at strange hours, mixing compounds that made his eyes water and his skin crawl. He documented Lysandra's obsession with ancient texts about bloodline purity, manuscripts that spoke of power gained through keeping divine blood undiluted. Most disturbing were Aurelian's dreams, which he shared with Gavril during his monthly health examinations. Dreams of children with too many eyes, of a golden throne cracking down the middle, of blood that burned like acid. The worst was yet to come. On the night of the summer solstice, when the empire celebrated the feast of their sun god, Aurelian would make an announcement that would echo through history. He would stand before the greatest nobles of the realm, take his sister's hand, and declare their intention to wed. The chalice of wine in the high priest's hand would shatter. 3 ravens would fall dead from the rafters. And in the royal tombs beneath the palace, the preserved corpse of their grandfather would be found the next morning turned to face the wall, as if even the dead couldn't bear to look upon what was to come. But that shocking night was still months away. First came the seduction, the justifications, the slow poison of ambition that would transform love into something monstrous. First came the whispers in darkened corridors, the forbidden books consulted by candlelight, and the terrible moment when 2 brilliant minds convinced themselves that their transgression would birth a dynasty of gods rather than monsters. The story of Aurelian and Lysandra's twisted path began 23 years before that fateful announcement, in the golden halls of a palace that had never known such tragedy. Their father, King Darius IV, had married a distant cousin from the northern provinces, a woman of impeccable bloodline whose violet eyes marked her as a true descendant of Heir. The pregnancy had been difficult. Palace midwives reported strange occurrences. The queen's belly would glow faintly in the darkness, and more than once, servants claimed to hear two distinct heartbeats that seemed to synchronize and separate in an unsettling rhythm. When the twins were finally born on a night when both moons hung full in the sky, the attending physician noted in his records that they emerged holding hands, their tiny fingers intertwined so tightly that it took considerable effort to separate them. From their earliest days, Aurelian and Lysandra displayed an unnatural connection. Their wet nurses reported that when one infant cried, the other would immediately follow, regardless of distance. When Lysandra caught a fever at age 3, Aurelian developed identical symptoms despite being kept in isolation. Their tutors marveled at how they seemed to complete each other's thoughts, often answering questions posed to their sibling without hesitation. The court astronomer, summoned to cast their birth charts, fled the palace in the middle of the night after completing his calculations, leaving behind only a single word scrawled repeatedly across his notes: abomination. The first true sign of darkness came when they were 7 years old. A young servant girl named Mara had been assigned to tend to Lysandra's chambers. She was pretty, with cornsilk hair and a gentle disposition that made her popular among the palace staff. One morning she was found at the bottom of the servants' stairwell, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. Witnesses reported seeing her leaving Lysandra's room in tears just minutes before her death, though the princess claimed Mara had simply delivered her morning wash water and left without incident. What troubled the investigators more was young Aurelian's reaction, or rather his lack of one. When informed of the tragedy, the boy prince had simply nodded and returned to his studies, mentioning only that Lysandra didn't like how she touched her hair. The matter was quietly dismissed as an accident, the first of many such incidents that would be swept beneath the palace's priceless carpets. Their education was extraordinary even by royal standards. The emperor spared no expense in cultivating their obvious brilliance. Master scholars from across the empire were brought to court, each specializing in different areas of knowledge. Aurelian showed an early aptitude for military strategy and statecraft, while Lysandra excelled in mathematics and natural philosophy. But it was in their private studies that disturbing patterns emerged. Their shared tutor in ancient languages, a learned man named Theon, discovered them one night in the restricted section of the royal library. They had somehow obtained a key and were poring over texts that had been sealed away for centuries, books that spoke of bloodline cultivation, of the power that could be harvested from keeping divine essence pure. When Theon tried to confiscate the materials, Lysandra had looked at him with those unsettling violet eyes and said, "You have a daughter in the lower city, don't you, Master Theon? Pretty little thing. It would be tragic if something happened to her." The tutor had backed away, and within a week he had resigned his position and left the capital with his family. As they entered adolescence, their bond only intensified. Courtiers began to notice how they would seek each other out at every opportunity, how their eyes would find one another across crowded throne rooms. During state dinners, they insisted on being seated together, and more than one ambassador reported feeling deeply uncomfortable watching them interact. The lingering touches, the whispered conversations in languages no one else could understand, the way they seemed to exist in a world that excluded everyone else. Their mother, Queen Lysandra, tried to intervene, arranging for them to be educated separately and pushing for early betrothals that might redirect their obviously unhealthy attachment. Her efforts ended when she fell mysteriously ill after a family dinner. The queen lingered for 3 agonizing months, her body wasting away despite the efforts of the realm's greatest healers. In her delirium, she would sometimes cry out about the children's eyes and the taste of bitter almonds, but her words were dismissed as fever dreams. The death of their mother marked a turning point. King Darius, devastated by the loss of his wife and increasingly wary of his own children, threw himself into expanding the empire's borders through constant military campaigns. This left Aurelian and Lysandra effectively rulers of the court in his absence. They were 16 now, and their beauty had become legendary. Aurelian stood tall and lean, with the athletic build of a warrior and a face that sculptors would weep to capture. Lysandra had blossomed into a woman whose beauty was described as almost painful to behold, with silk black hair that fell to her waist and those distinctive violet eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient knowledge. Suitors came from every corner of the empire and beyond, but none lasted long. Lord Marcus, who had pressed his suit too aggressively with Lysandra, was found dead in his bed, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Prince Caspar, who had won Aurelian's initial approval as a match for his sister, suddenly broke off the engagement and entered a monastery, refusing to speak of what had changed his mind. The palace servants began to whisper about the cursed twins, though never within earshot of the royals. But this was only the beginning. The true descent into darkness would begin with a single book, discovered in the ruins of an ancient temple during one of their father's campaigns. The text, written in a language that predated the empire itself, spoke of the power that could be achieved through the union of divine twins, of bloodlines kept so pure that they could birth gods. When the book arrived at the palace as part of the war spoils, it was Lysandra who recognized its significance, and Aurelian who used his authority to claim it for their private collection. They would spend the next 3 years studying its contents, preparing for the moment when they would have the power to act on its promises. They did not yet know that the book itself was cursed, that every royal family who had possessed it had met terrible ends, or that its pages were written not in ink, but in the blood of the damned. The curse that would plague the Aurelian bloodline did not manifest as simple death. It was far more creative, far more cruel. The ancient text that Aurelian and Lysandra had discovered spoke of blood magic, but what it truly described were methods of corruption that would twist both body and soul across generations. The book, later known as the Codex Sanguinis, detailed rituals that required specific preparations that history would remember as some of the most disturbing practices ever committed in the name of power. The first ritual required the creation of what the text called the Chamber of Unity. Deep beneath the palace, in catacombs that predated even the empire's founding, Aurelian ordered the construction of a circular room lined with mirrors made from volcanic glass. Each mirror was inscribed with symbols that hurt to look upon, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. The floor was inlaid with a massive seal crafted from silver and human bone. The bones, the text specified, had to come from blood relatives who had died violating natural law. Grave robbers were secretly commissioned to plunder the tomb of Prince Varus, Aurelian's great-uncle who had murdered his brother for the throne, and Princess Katharina, who had poisoned her own children rather than see them surpass her. The construction took 6 months, and of the dozen workers who built it, none lived to see its completion. Each met with accidents that left their bodies twisted in ways that defied explanation. Spines bent backward, limbs fused together, faces frozen in expressions of impossible anguish. The Codex described 3 primary rituals, each more horrific than the last. The first was the blood wedding itself, a ceremony that perverted traditional marriage rites in ways that would make even hardened soldiers weep. The couple was required to fast for 7 days, consuming only a mixture of wine, honey, and drops of each other's blood. On the night of the ceremony they would descend into the Chamber of Unity naked, their bodies painted with symbols using a paste made from ground pearls, mercury, and the ashes of stillborn children. The ritual required them to consummate their union 7 times, each time cutting matching wounds on their bodies and allowing their blood to mingle on the seal below. With each act they would speak vows not to any god, but to the darkness itself, promising their bloodline in exchange for power. The mirrors would capture and amplify their transgression, reflecting it into eternity. Palace guards later reported hearing sounds from below that night that made them flee their posts. Not screams but something worse. Laughter that didn't sound human, mixed with words in a language that predated human speech. The second ritual, performed during Lysandra's pregnancy, was perhaps even more disturbing. Called the feeding of the unborn, it required the expectant mother to consume specific substances meant to strengthen the child's connection to the supernatural. Each month, she would drink a potion made from rare herbs, powdered gemstones, and the blood of animals killed at the moment of giving birth. But the final ingredient was the most horrific: tears collected from mothers who had lost their children, harvested through a process that involved keeping these grieving women in special chambers and subjecting them to constant reminders of their loss. Lysandra would drink these potions while sitting in the Chamber of Unity, surrounded by those terrible mirrors, speaking to her unborn child in the ancient tongue. Servants tasked with cleaning the chamber afterward reported finding the mirrors cracked, with what looked like tiny handprints pressed against them from the inside. The third and final ritual was meant to be performed after the birth, a blessing that would seal the child's fate as a divine being. It required the sacrifice of 100 white doves, their blood collected in a basin made from a single piece of jade. The infant would be bathed in this blood while both parents spoke incantations over it, calling upon powers that should never be named. But the ritual demanded more. It required a human sacrifice, specifically someone who shared blood with the royal line but had remained pure. This led to one of the darkest chapters in the palace's history. Aurelian's young cousin, a girl of only 12 named Serena, vanished from her chambers one night. Her body was never found, but servants cleaning the Chamber of Unity the next day discovered a small golden locket she always wore, melted and fused to the floor near the seal. The physical transformations began almost immediately after these rituals. Aurelian developed what he called the sight, the ability to see through the eyes of anyone who shared his blood. At first he considered it a gift, using it to spy on potential enemies and ensure loyalty among distant relatives. But the visions came unbidden and uncontrolled. He would collapse during state meetings, his consciousness suddenly pulled into the perspective of a third cousin fighting in a border skirmish, feeling every sword blow as if it were his own. Worse were the night visions when he would see through the eyes of his ancestors, including those long dead. He wrote in his private journal of witnessing ancient battles, of seeing the world through the eyes of corpses as they rotted in their tombs, of experiencing death over and over again through his bloodline's history. Lysandra's transformation was different but equally horrific. She developed what she termed the hunger, an insatiable craving that food could not satisfy. At first she thought it was related to her pregnancy, but it persisted and worsened after giving birth. She would consume massive quantities of the finest delicacies, only to remain painfully hungry. Then came the discovery that terrified even her. The hunger could only be sated by consuming things that held life essence. She started with raw meat, scandalizing the court by demanding her venison nearly alive. But that soon wasn't enough. Palace pets began disappearing. Then came darker rumors, of servants found with bite marks, of Lysandra keeping certain prisoners in the dungeons not for interrogation but for feeding. Her teeth, once perfect pearls, grew sharp and pointed. Her violet eyes developed a red ring around the iris that glowed when the hunger took her. The children born of their union bore the curse in ways that defied nature itself. Their firstborn, Prince Aldrich, seemed normal at birth, but as he grew, servants noticed disturbing anomalies. His shadow didn't match his movements, it would sometimes gesture on its own or remain still while he walked. By age 5 he could make others see illusions so vivid that 3 nursemaids had thrown themselves from tower windows, convinced they were stepping onto solid ground. The second child, Princess Morgana, was born with a full set of teeth and eyes that were completely black. She never cried, never laughed, but would stare at people with an intensity that made grown men weep. She spoke her first words at 6 months, not baby talk, but perfect sentences in the ancient language her parents had used in their rituals. But it was the third child that truly showed the extent of their damnation. The baby was born with scales instead of skin, gills that opened and closed on its neck, and webbed fingers that ended in claws. It lived for only 3 days, during which the palace was plagued by supernatural events. Wine turned to blood in goblets, mirrors showed reflections of things that weren't there, and every night at midnight, the sound of a baby crying echoed through the halls, even though the creature itself made no sound. When it finally died, its body dissolved into a black liquid that ate through stone, leaving a hole in the floor that seemed to go down forever. Aurelian had it sealed, but servants reported that on quiet nights, you could still hear breathing coming from below. Among the countless souls who suffered under the cursed reign of Aurelian and Lysandra, the story of Lady Celestine stands as perhaps the most heartbreaking. She had been a childhood friend of Lysandra, the daughter of a loyal duke who had served the royal family for generations. Celestine was everything the princess was not, golden-haired where Lysandra was dark, gentle where the princess was fierce, devoted to the gods while Lysandra scorned them. For years she had been the only person outside their twisted bond whom the royal twins seemed to genuinely care for. She would spend hours in the palace gardens with them, and servants noted that in her presence, the twins seemed almost normal, laughing at innocent jokes, playing childhood games, acting like the noble children they should have been. But everything changed after the blood wedding. Celestine had been horrified by the union, one of the few at court brave enough to voice her objections. She had come to Lysandra's chambers the night before the ceremony, falling to her knees and begging her friend to reconsider. "This is not love," she had wept. "This is madness. The gods will curse you for this abomination." Lysandra had embraced her then, stroking her golden hair with apparent tenderness. "Sweet Celestine," she had whispered, "you will understand in time. You will help us show the world that love transcends all boundaries." That should have been Celestine's warning to flee, but her loyalty and hope that she could still save her friend kept her at court. The transformation of Celestine from beloved friend to favored victim began subtly. After Lysandra developed the hunger, she would request Celestine's presence during her feeding times, claiming that her friend's company soothed the cravings. At first, it seemed harmless enough. They would sit together while Lysandra consumed her increasingly disturbing meals. But then came the requests for small favors. A drop of blood to add to her wine, claiming it would ease her suffering. A lock of that beautiful golden hair for a ritual that would supposedly control the curse. Celestine, still believing she was helping her friend, complied. She didn't notice how Lysandra's eyes would glow red as she drank the blood-tainted wine, or how she would caress the lock of hair with an expression that was equal parts love and hunger. The true horror began when Lysandra gave birth to Prince Aldrich. The difficult labor had nearly killed her, and in her delirium she had called repeatedly for Celestine. Her friend had rushed to her side, holding her hand through the worst of it. But when the child was finally born with his shadow that moved independently, Lysandra had grabbed Celestine's wrist with inhuman strength. "He needs a guardian," she had hissed, her grip tight enough to leave bruises. "Someone pure to balance what we have made impure. You will be his light, Celestine. Forever." Before anyone could intervene, Lysandra had bitten deep into Celestine's wrist, drinking deeply while speaking words in that ancient tongue. Celestine's screams had echoed through the birthing chamber, but when the physicians tried to intervene, Aurelian had drawn his sword, his eyes glowing with the same unnatural light as his sister's. What followed was a nightmare that lasted years. Celestine found herself bound to the young prince in ways that defied explanation. She could feel his emotions, his hungers, his darkness pressing against her mind. When he was upset, she would experience physical pain. When he used his shadow powers to torment servants, she would see through the shadows, experiencing both the predator's joy and the victim's terror. She tried to flee multiple times, but distance only made the connection more painful. Once, she made it as far as the border before collapsing, blood pouring from her nose and ears as the prince's rage at her abandonment manifested physically in her body. The guards who found her reported that she was speaking in two voices, her own begging for death and the child's demanding she return. The palace became her prison, but worse was yet to come. As Aldrich grew, so did his powers and his cruelty. He would force Celestine to participate in his games, making her watch as he drove servants mad with illusions, holding her eyes open when she tried to look away. He discovered that causing her pain somehow enhanced his abilities, and would spend hours finding new ways to make her suffer without quite killing her. The other courtiers, terrified of the royal family, pretended not to notice her deterioration. Her once golden hair turned white. Her skin, previously glowing with health, became translucent, showing the dark veins beneath. Most disturbing were her eyes. One remained her natural blue, while the other had turned violet, marking her as claimed by the cursed bloodline. The birth of Princess Morgana only deepened Celestine's torment. The infant, with her solid black eyes and unnatural stillness, seemed to recognize Celestine as a kindred prisoner. In a grotesque parody of affection, the baby would only calm when held by the tortured woman. But holding Morgana was agony. Her touch burned like ice, and looking into those black eyes showed Celestine visions of her own death in 1,000 different ways. Yet she was compelled to care for the child, her body moving against her will to comfort the monstrous infant. Lysandra would watch these interactions with savage satisfaction, telling Celestine, "See how they love you? You are part of our family now, forever and always." The final torment came with the birth of the scaled creature, the third child that lived only 3 days. During those 3 days, Celestine experienced hell beyond description. The thing's very existence was antithetical to natural life, and as someone bound to the bloodline, she felt its wrongness in every fiber of her being. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely breathe. Her skin began to crack and bleed as if rejecting its own existence. When the creature finally died and dissolved into that terrible black liquid, some of it splashed onto Celestine. Where it touched, her flesh withered and turned gray, leaving marks that looked like scales. But she didn't die. The curse wouldn't let her. Celestine's journal, discovered years after her disappearance, provides the most detailed account of life under the twins' rule. Her final entries are barely coherent, written in a shaking hand that switches between languages, sometimes mid-sentence. She writes of seeing the future through Aldrich's eyes, generations of monsters born from the cursed bloodline, each more terrible than the last. She describes Lysandra's final visit to her chambers, where the queen had embraced her and whispered, "I'm going to give you a gift, sweet Celestine. I'm going to make you truly immortal, so you can watch over our children forever." The journal ends with a single line repeated over and over, "Please let me die, please let me die, please let me die." Celestine vanished that night. Some say Lysandra finally consumed her entirely, adding her essence to the cursed bloodline. Others claim she was transformed into something inhuman and locked in the deepest dungeons. But servants would sometimes report seeing a figure in white wandering the halls at night, weeping golden tears. And when each new cursed child was born in generations to come, witnesses would swear they heard a woman's voice screaming in the distance. A scream that sounded like it had been going on for so long that it had worn through madness into something worse. The children's nurses learned to ignore it, telling themselves it was just the wind. But those who had known Celestine recognized the voice, and they would cross themselves and pray for a mercy that would never come. The true magnitude of the Aurelian curse became apparent only in the decades following the blood wedding. What began as the corruption of two souls spread like a plague through bloodlines and across continents. By the time of Aurelian's death, 37 years after his unholy union with Lysandra, the curse had claimed over 3,000 direct victims, and countless more who suffered its indirect effects. The royal archivists, commanded to document the spread of what they termed the divine affliction, filled 17 volumes with names, dates, and descriptions of horror that taxed the mind to comprehend. The mathematics of suffering were staggering. Every child born to the cursed bloodline carried the taint, but it manifested differently based on their proximity to the original sin. Direct descendants, the children and grandchildren of Aurelian and Lysandra, bore the worst of it. Of the 13 children they produced together, only 4 survived to adulthood, and those 4 were monsters in human form. Prince Aldrich grew to become Aldrich the Shadow King, whose reign of terror lasted 43 years and saw the execution of over 800 nobles who opposed him. Princess Morgana, she of the black eyes, established the Order of the Void, a cult that practiced human sacrifice on an industrial scale. By the time she was overthrown, her followers had murdered approximately 2,000 innocents in rituals designed to feed the bloodline's hunger. Prince Cassius, born with the ability to control minds, turned the entire population of 3 cities into his puppets, forcing parents to murder children, lovers to torture each other, until madness and death were the only escape. The 4th survivor, Princess Talia, seemed normal until her 20th birthday, when she transformed into something chroniclers could only describe as a living plague. Wherever she walked, people developed boils that burst into swarms of flies, crops withered, and water turned to poison. She killed approximately 12,000 people before finally being burned alive by a coalition of neighboring kingdoms. But the curse didn't limit itself to direct descendants. It spread through marriage, through blood, through proximity to power. Noble families who intermarried with the Aurelians found their own children born wrong. The Duke of Ravencrest, who married one of Aldrich's daughters, sired twin boys born joined at the spine, sharing organs in impossible ways. They lived for 16 years, one head screaming constantly while the other laughed. The Countess of Marlowe, who took one of Cassius's sons as her husband, gave birth to a daughter who aged rapidly, growing from infant to crone in the span of a month, then reversing the process, trapped in an endless cycle of birth and death. Each cycle, she retained the memories of her previous lives, and her screams of existential horror could be heard throughout the castle. The geographical spread was equally horrifying. The Aurelian Empire at its height encompassed 43 provinces across 3 continents. In each provincial capital, members of the extended royal family ruled as governors, and each carried the curse in their blood. The city of Valdris in the northern provinces became known as the City of Nightmares after Governor Marcus Aurelian, a great-nephew of the original twins, began projecting his dreams into reality. Citizens would wake to find their homes transformed into slaughterhouses, their loved ones replaced by creatures of living shadow. Over 3 years, the population dropped from 50,000 to less than 3,000, with most fleeing or taking their own lives rather than endure another night. The southern port city of Gold Haven saw its entire harbor turn to blood when Princess Lavinia Aurelian, consumed by the hunger like her ancestor Lysandra, attempted to feed on the ocean itself. The blood tide killed every living thing in the water for miles, and the stench of rotting sea life made the city uninhabitable for a generation. The curse created an entire economy of suffering. The Order of the Void, established by Princess Morgana, grew from a handful of devoted followers to an organization with chapters in every major city. They recruited from the desperate and the mad, promising power in exchange for service to the bloodline. By the height of their influence, they operated 43 temples where regular sacrifices were performed. Conservative estimates suggest they killed at least 100 people per month per temple, a total of over 50,000 victims during their 60-year existence. These weren't random murders but carefully orchestrated rituals. Victims were selected based on specific criteria: purity of bloodline, strength of will, depth of innocence. Children were particularly prized, especially those who showed signs of magical talent or divine blessing. The order developed an entire bureaucracy around murder, with record keepers who documented each sacrifice, recruitment officers who identified victims, and disposal teams who ensured bodies were never found. The infrastructure required to support the cursed bloodlines rule was vast and terrible. The Palace of Echoing Screams, built by Aldrich to replace the original royal palace, required the labor of 20,000 slaves over 10 years. The building itself was designed to channel and amplify suffering. Acoustic chambers that would carry the sounds of torture throughout the structure, mirrors placed to ensure prisoners could watch their own degradation, floors that could be heated to burning or cooled to freezing at the turn of a lever. The palace dungeons could hold 3,000 prisoners simultaneously, and they were rarely less than full. Special chambers were constructed for different purposes. The bleeding rooms, where those with useful bloodlines were kept alive and regularly drained. The madness halls, where prisoners were subjected to Aldrich's shadow illusions until their minds shattered. The nurseries, where pregnant women were held until they gave birth, their children taken for purposes too horrible to fully document. The resistance movements that arose faced not just political oppression but supernatural horror. The Brotherhood of the Cleansing Flame, formed by priests and paladins from uncorrupted temples, attempted to organize opposition to the cursed dynasty. Of their original 500 members, none survived the first year. They were hunted by creatures that defied description, hounds made of shadow that could track a man's soul, birds with human faces that whispered madness, insects that burrowed under skin and ate their way out from inside. The few written accounts from Brotherhood members describe a world where reality itself had become hostile. One paladin wrote of walking through a forest where every tree bled when touched, where the ground would open to reveal eyes that watched and mouths that whispered promises of pain. Another described entering a village that seemed normal until nightfall, when every inhabitant revealed themselves to be wearing the faces of his dead comrades. The medical documentation of the curse's effects fills libraries. Physicians who studied the afflicted and survived the experience documented hundreds of distinct manifestations. Beyond the monstrous births and physical deformities, there were subtler horrors. Some carriers of the bloodline seemed normal but left corruption in their wake. Every person they touched would develop tumors within days, every plant they tended would grow poisonous thorns. Others suffered from temporal displacement, aging and de-aging randomly, sometimes experiencing multiple lifetimes in a single day. The curse could skip generations only to emerge stronger. One family recorded 3 generations of apparent normalcy before the 4th produced a child who could unmake reality with a thought, erasing people from existence so thoroughly that even memories of them vanished. By the time of the dynasty's fall, the empire's population had dropped from 12 million to fewer than 4 million. Entire regions were abandoned, deemed too corrupted for human habitation. The economic cost was incalculable. Trade routes disrupted by supernatural phenomena, farmland poisoned by cursed blood, cities emptied by fear and madness. But numbers alone cannot capture the true scale of suffering. Every victim had a name, a story, loved ones who mourned them. Every child born twisted by the curse had parents who had hoped for better. Every soul sacrificed on the Order's altars had dreams that would never be fulfilled. The empire that Aurelian and Lysandra had sought to make eternal through their unholy union had become a charnel house, a monument to the price of defying natural law. And still, the worst was yet to come, for the curse had developed a life of its own, spreading and mutating beyond even what its creators had intended. At the center of this web of suffering stood Aurelian himself, transformed by decades of dark power into something that could barely be called human. The handsome prince who had once inspired poets had become a creature of nightmares. His body, maintained by unnatural means, had grown to nearly 7 feet tall, but twisted. His spine curved in ways that should have killed him, allowing him to contort and move like a serpent. His violet eyes had become multifaceted like an insect's, seeing in all directions, across multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. Court painters who attempted to capture his likeness invariably went mad, claiming that his true form was too terrible for canvas to hold. One artist, before taking his own life, left a note saying simply, "He has too many faces and all of them are screaming." The transformation had been gradual, each ritual and atrocity adding to his corruption. After the 3rd child's death, Aurelian had begun experimenting with the boundaries of his newfound power. He discovered he could extend his consciousness into any of his blood relatives, not just seeing through their eyes but controlling their actions. At first, he used this ability strategically, forcing distant cousins to assassinate rivals or reveal secrets. But the power was addictive. He began spending days at a time dispersed among dozens of bodies, experiencing multiple lives simultaneously. The strain of maintaining his original form while scattered across so many vessels warped both his body and mind. Servants reported finding him in his chambers conducting conversations with himself in different voices, each representing a relative he was currently possessing. His methods of rule became increasingly baroque in their cruelty. The traditional royal court was replaced by what he called the Parliament of Screams, a gathering where noble families were required to send representatives who would be tortured throughout the proceedings. Aurelian claimed the pain clarified their thinking and ensured honest discourse. Laws were written in blood on human skin, with the donor kept alive to ensure the law remained valid. His tax collectors didn't just take gold, they collected suffering itself, measured in precise units. A family might pay their annual tribute with the terror of a child, bottled and preserved, or the despair of a dying parent, crystallized into gems that Aurelian wore in his crown. Those who couldn't pay in coin could pay in pain, submitting to tortures that were carefully calculated to extract the maximum suffering without causing death. But it was in his role as father that Aurelian showed his truest monstrosity. He viewed his cursed children not as offspring but as experiments, extensions of his will to be shaped and perfected. Prince Aldrich's education in the shadow arts involved being locked in rooms of pure darkness for months at a time, fed only when he could successfully manipulate shadows to steal food from other parts of the palace. When the boy showed reluctance to harm others, Aurelian possessed his body and used it to murder Aldrich's favorite servant, ensuring his son experienced every sensation of the killing. Princess Morgana was subjected to rituals designed to deepen her void, including being buried alive repeatedly until she no longer feared death, only to discover worse things than death waiting in the darkness. Each child was both victim and weapon, broken and reforged in their father's image. Lysandra's transformation was different but equally horrific. Where Aurelian became a creature of control and calculated cruelty, she became something primal and hungry. The hunger that had begun during her pregnancy evolved into something that consumed her entirely. Her body changed to accommodate her appetites. Her jaw could unhinge like a snake's, her teeth grew in multiple rows, her digestive system became capable of processing materials that should have been impossible to consume. She no longer ate food in any traditional sense but rather consumed essence itself. Servants spoke in whispers of finding her in the kitchens, draining the life from still living animals with a touch. But animals soon weren't enough. She began with prisoners telling herself they were condemned anyway. Then servants who displeased her. Then anyone who caught her attention when the hunger grew too strong. Her court became a grotesque parody of its former elegance. She would hold elaborate feasts where she was the only one who truly ate, while courtiers were forced to watch her consume things that shouldn't be consumed. She developed a particular taste for consuming memories. She could draw them out of a person like thread from a spindle, leaving them empty and confused. Her favorite victims were mothers. She would consume their memories of their children, leaving them unable to recognize their own offspring. The children, driven mad by their parents' blank stares, provided a second course of despair for her to feast upon. She kept certain courtiers alive for years in this state, hollow shells that moved through the palace like ghosts, unable to remember who they were or why they suffered. The relationship between Aurelian and Lysandra, once defined by twisted passion, evolved into something even more disturbing. They no longer saw each other as individuals but as two halves of a single monstrous entity. They would speak in unison, finish each other's sentences, move in perfect synchronization. Sexual congress between them had become something else entirely, a merging of corrupted energies that warped reality around them. Servants unfortunate enough to be in the palace during their unions reported walls bleeding, gravity reversing, time moving backward. One scribe documented seeing the same moment repeat 17 times, each iteration slightly different, as if reality itself was stuttering. After such events, new horrors would invariably emerge. Plagues that turned people inside out, rains of boiling blood, newborns across the empire born with pieces missing, as if something had taken bites out of them in the womb. The extended royal family, those who carried diluted versions of the curse, became a hierarchy of horrors. Prince Valerius, Aurelian's nephew, developed the ability to steal faces. He would peel them off like masks and wear them, gaining access to the victim's memories and abilities while leaving them a faceless horror. Duchess Serafina, a cousin twice removed, could weave nightmares into physical form, creating tapestries that would trap viewers in eternal torment. Count Lucian, married into the bloodline, found that his touch turned pleasure to pain. Every caress became agony, every kiss burned like acid. He took particular joy in corrupting young lovers, forcing them to experience torture in their most intimate moments. But perhaps the most terrifying were those who seemed normal, who hid their corruption behind masks of sanity. Lord Commander Thaddeus, Aurelian's half-brother and leader of the imperial armies, appeared to be the perfect soldier, disciplined, honorable, efficient. Only his closest subordinates knew that he required regular infusions of blood from young recruits to maintain his facade. He had developed a system where one soldier from each unit would disappear during training, their life force distributed among their commanders. The armies themselves became extensions of the curse, spreading corruption wherever they marched. Battles weren't just won. Enemies were transformed, turned into breeding stock for new horrors or raw materials for dark rituals. The corruption spread to every institution. The Imperial Academy, once a center of learning, became a factory for producing servants of the bloodline. Children showing intellectual promise were taken from their families and subjected to indoctrination that broke their minds and rebuilt them in service to the curse. The most brilliant became the architects of suffering, scholars who developed new methods of torture, new rituals to spread the bloodline's power, new ways to break the laws of nature. They created devices that could extract pain and store it, mirrors that showed viewers their worst possible futures, books that rewrote themselves with the reader's darkest secrets. The Academy's libraries filled with knowledge that should never have existed, formulas for unmaking souls, blueprints for engines that ran on human despair. By the height of their power, the monsters wearing human faces had created a perfect system of horror. Every institution served their hunger, every law existed to facilitate suffering, every citizen was both victim and potential predator. The empire had become a vast organism dedicated to a single purpose, feeding the endless appetite of the cursed bloodline. And at its heart sat Aurelian and Lysandra, no longer king and queen but something far worse, gods of a hell they had created, ruling over a kingdom of the damned. The most chilling aspect of the Aurelian dynasty's reign of terror was not the monsters themselves, but the society that enabled, supported, and even celebrated their atrocities. The empire that had once prided itself on law, culture, and divine favor transformed into a vast machine of complicity where ordinary citizens became willing participants in unspeakable horrors. The corruption spread like a disease through every level of society, turning neighbor against neighbor, parent against child, until the very concept of morality became a distant memory. The transformation began with the nobility who saw opportunity in the chaos. Lord Blackwood, master of the Northern Territories, was among the first to recognize that displaying cruelty earned royal favor. He instituted loyalty trials in his lands, public spectacles where citizens were forced to prove their dedication to the crown through acts of violence against their own families. A father might be commanded to choose which of his children would live. A wife would be forced to torture her husband to demonstrate her allegiance superseded marriage vows. Those who refused were declared traitors, their entire bloodlines subject to extermination. Those who complied were rewarded with positions, wealth, and most importantly, protection from becoming victims themselves. Within 2 years, every noble house in the empire had adopted similar practices, competing to devise more creative demonstrations of loyalty. The merchant class, always pragmatic, found ways to profit from the suffering. The Gilded Hand Trading Company cornered the market on implements of torture, producing everything from simple thumb screws to elaborate devices that could keep victims alive for months while in constant agony. They employed artists to make these devices beautiful, covering them in gold leaf and precious gems, turning instruments of pain into status symbols. Wealthy families would commission custom torture devices the way they once commissioned portraits, each trying to outdo the others in baroque cruelty. The company's catalogs, which survived the dynasty's fall, read like manuals of madness. Detailed descriptions of each device's capabilities, testimonials from satisfied customers, even payment plans for those who couldn't afford their atrocities up front. The religious institutions, which should have been bastions of resistance, instead became some of the most enthusiastic supporters of the regime. High Priest Matthias declared that the royal family's divine blood made their actions beyond mortal judgment. He rewrote holy texts, claiming to have discovered hidden verses that prophesied the coming of god-kings who would rule through necessary cruelty. The temple of the sun god was transformed into the temple of the bleeding sun, where human sacrifice became not just accepted but mandated. Every family was required to provide one member for sacrifice each decade, a tithe of blood that supposedly ensured divine favor. Parents would raise children specifically for this purpose, sacrifice-born, who were pampered and indulged until their appointed time, told from birth that their pain would buy their family's prosperity. The academic institutions proved equally corruptible. The University of Valdres, once renowned for philosophy and natural science, redirected its entire focus to what they termed suffering studies. Professors who had spent their lives studying mathematics or astronomy were required to attend re-education sessions where they learned the new sciences. Taxonomy was replaced with the classification of screams. Music theory evolved into the study of how to compose symphonies of suffering. Medical students no longer learned to heal but to harm in ways that maximized pain while preventing death. Doctoral theses were written on subjects like the optimal duration of hope before despair and generational trauma as a renewable resource. Students who showed squeamishness were expelled or became test subjects for their more committed classmates. The cultural transformation was perhaps the most insidious. Theater troupes abandoned traditional plays in favor of reality performances, where actual torture was incorporated into the show. The famous playwright Garrett Swan wrote a series of dramas that required the actual death of at least one performer per show, with the role of victim being played by condemned prisoners or volunteers seeking fame through memorable death. Audiences would bid on which character should die and how, turning murder into interactive entertainment. Visual artists abandoned painting landscapes or portraits in favor of blood canvases. Works created using human blood, skin and other materials that made each piece a record of suffering. The most celebrated artist of the period, Madame Corvina, was known for keeping her subjects alive during the entire creation process, their screams considered part of the artwork's ambience. Even children were not spared from this societal corruption. Schools implemented curricula designed to normalize cruelty from the youngest age. Children learned arithmetic by calculating pain ratios, studied history through the lens of successful oppression, practiced writing by copying out confessions extracted through torture. Playground games evolved to include miniature versions of adult cruelties. One popular game involved children taking turns as inquisitor and heretic, with points awarded for how quickly they could make their playmates cry. Parents encouraged this, knowing that children who showed aptitude for cruelty were more likely to find favor with the regime. Birthday parties might feature the torture of small animals as entertainment, with a birthday child getting to deliver the killing blow. The economy itself restructured around suffering. New professions emerged to serve the regime's needs. Pain merchants traveled between towns, purchasing anguish from the poor to sell to the wealthy who needed to pay their suffering taxes. Memory thieves specialized in extracting and selling recollections, creating a black market in happy memories that people could no longer create naturally. Grief farmers established facilities where they would cultivate sorrow, keeping people in states of perpetual loss to harvest their tears for Lysandra's potions. The currency itself changed. Alongside traditional gold and silver, pain coins were minted, each one supposedly containing a measured amount of distilled agony. These became the preferred currency for any transaction with the government, leading to an entire economy of harvested suffering. The legal system abandoned any pretense of justice, becoming instead a theatrical display of predetermined cruelty. Trials were held in arena-like courthouses where the public could watch and wager on outcomes. Guilt or innocence mattered less than entertainment value. Lawyers competed not on legal arguments but on their creativity in proposing punishments. A simple theft might result in the criminal's hands being replaced with those of a beast, forcing them to live with alien appendages. Adultery could lead to lovers being surgically fused together, condemned to spend eternity in a mockery of their desired closeness. The most successful lawyers were those who could make the audience gasp with their innovative cruelties, turning justice into grand guignol theater. The social hierarchies that emerged were based entirely on one's relationship to suffering, either as inflictor or victim. At the top were the blessed cruel, those who had proven their dedication through spectacular acts of sadism. They wore special insignias made from human bone, each piece representing a significant atrocity. Below them were the willing participants, ordinary citizens who enthusiastically supported the regime. Then came the reluctant compliant, those who participated out of fear rather than enthusiasm. At the bottom were the designated victims, those whose bloodlines or actions had marked them for perpetual suffering. But these categories were fluid. Today's torturer could be tomorrow's victim if they showed any sign of weakness or mercy. The architecture of cities changed to reflect this new reality. Public squares that once held markets now featured permanent torture installations. Residential buildings were required to include discipline rooms, where families could carry out mandatory cruelty rituals. The soundproofing industry boomed as wealthy citizens sought to muffle the screams from their neighbors' homes, not out of compassion but to avoid noise complaints. Cities developed underground networks of tunnels and chambers designed for disposing of bodies, creating literal cities of the dead beneath the cities of the living. Maps from this period show not just streets and buildings but zones of anguish, where particular types of suffering were concentrated. Perhaps most disturbing was how this became normalized across generations. Children born into this system knew no other way of life. To them, watching public executions was as normal as we might consider watching a parade. They grew up believing that love and pain were inseparable, that causing suffering was a form of affection. Marriage ceremonies included vows to hurt one another in prescribed ways. Parents showed their love for children through calculated cruelties meant to strengthen them. By the third generation of Aurelian rule, most citizens couldn't even conceive of a world without institutionalized horror. When foreign ambassadors expressed shock at common practices, they were genuinely puzzled. How else could a society function? This was the true victory of the cursed bloodline. They had created a world where their monstrosity was not just accepted but required, where choosing kindness was not just dangerous but literally unthinkable. The beginning of the end came not through heroic resistance or divine intervention, but through the very corruption that had sustained the dynasty for so long. After 87 years of rule, the cursed bloodline had become so twisted, so removed from humanity, that it began to devour itself. The first crack appeared when Prince Aldrich, now in his 60s but maintained by dark magic, discovered that his shadow realm had begun to merge with reality. The careful boundaries he had maintained between illusion and truth dissolved, and his nightmares began manifesting without his control. The palace of echoing screams became a labyrinth of overlapping realities where past, present, and potential futures existed simultaneously. Courtiers would enter a room and find themselves in their own deaths, experience them fully, only to stumble out alive but changed, carrying the memory of their demise like a wound that wouldn't heal. The catalyst for change came from an unexpected source: Princess Morgana's final experiment. In her obsession with the void, she had attempted to birth something from pure nothingness. A child conceived not through physical union but through ritual negation of existence itself. The thing she created defied description, existing as an absence rather than a presence, a hole in reality that consumed everything it touched. She had intended it to be the ultimate weapon, but it recognized no master. The creature, if it could be called that, began unmaking the palace from within. Walls didn't crumble, they simply ceased to have ever existed. People didn't die, they were retroactively never born. Even the cursed bloodline's supernatural resilience meant nothing to something that attacked the very concept of existence. It was a young scribe named Marcus, ironically, a descendant of one of the dynasty's early victims, who discovered the key to their destruction. While cataloging the palace's vast libraries of forbidden knowledge, he found the original Codex Sanguinis. But more importantly, he found the notes Aurelian and Lysandra had made in the margins, including their deepest fear, that the curse they had created was not truly under their control. They had made pacts with entities they didn't fully understand, and those entities had their own agenda. The bloodline wasn't blessed with dark power, it was infected with it, and like any infection, it would eventually consume its host. Marcus also discovered references to a failsafe, a ritual of unbinding that could sever the connection to these dark powers, though at terrible cost. The information reached Sister Catherine, one of the few remaining members of the Brotherhood of the Cleansing Flame who had survived by hiding in plain sight as a palace servant. She had spent decades documenting the dynasty's atrocities while secretly maintaining a network of resistors. With Marcus's discovery, she finally had hope. But the ritual required specific components: the willing blood of one who carried the curse, an artifact from before the corruption began, and most crucially, a moment when the barriers between realities were weakest, which, thanks to Aldrich's failing control and Morgana's void child, was rapidly approaching. The unlikely ally came in the form of Prince Demon, Aldrich's youngest son, who had been born with a peculiar quirk in his curse. He could feel the pain of everyone his bloodline had hurt. Every torture, every murder, every moment of anguish inflicted by his family echoed through him constantly. He had spent his life in agony, driven nearly mad by the accumulated suffering of thousands. When Sister Catherine approached him with the possibility of ending it all, he didn't hesitate. Here was a chance not for redemption. He knew his bloodline was beyond that, but for cessation, for silence, for an end to the screaming that filled his every moment. The resistance that formed around this hope was unlike any that had come before. It included victims and perpetrators, those who had suffered and those who had inflicted suffering but could no longer bear the weight of their actions. Lord Commander Thaddeus, finally sickened by decades of draining his soldiers, provided military intelligence. Madame Corvina, the artist who had built her fame on blood canvases, used her position to smuggle resistors through her gallery shows. Even some of the blessed cruel, those who had risen highest in the hierarchy of horror, began to question whether they had traded their souls for a kingdom of ash. The moment of reckoning came during the Festival of Eternal Night, a celebration of the dynasty's power where reality was traditionally at its most malleable. Aldrich had planned a spectacular display. He would merge the shadow realm fully with the material world, creating a kingdom where nightmare and reality were one. Lysandra intended to finally achieve her ultimate hunger, consuming the life force of every citizen simultaneously to achieve a twisted form of godhood. But their plans required perfect synchronization, and the Void Child's chaotic influence had made such precision impossible. As the royal family gathered in the Chamber of Unity for the ritual, the resistance struck. Prince Demon, carrying the original crown worn by the twins' uncorrupted father, entered the chamber. His presence, bearing both the Bloodline's curse and an artifact of its innocence, created an impossible paradox. Sister Catherine and her followers had painted countersymbols throughout the palace, using their own blood mixed with tears willingly given, the exact opposite of the forced suffering the dynasty had built upon. Marcus and other scholars chanted not dark incantations but simple truths, reading aloud the names of victims, the stories of lives cut short, the weight of accumulated atrocity that the dynasty had tried to transform into power. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The carefully maintained spells that held the palace together began to unravel. Aurelian, faced with the contradiction of his cursed son carrying his father's pure crown, found his multiple bodies across the empire beginning to tear apart as his consciousness could no longer maintain its dispersal. Lysandra's hunger, denied its feast, turned inward, and she began consuming herself, her body folding in on itself in ways that violated physical law. The Void Child, drawn to the collapsing ritual, began unmaking the Chamber of Unity itself, erasing the very foundation of the curse. But the cursed bloodline would not die quietly. As their power collapsed, it lashed out indiscriminately. The palace transformed into a nightmare made manifest. Corridors became digestive tracts, stairs grew teeth, the air itself became poisonous with concentrated despair. Those who had participated in the dynasty's cruelties found their crimes made physical. Torturers' hands burst into flame that couldn't be extinguished. Those who had reveled in others' pain experienced every moment of it simultaneously. The blessed cruel discovered that their bone insignias had fused to their bodies, growing through skin and muscle like cancer. It was not justice, it was the curse's death throes as indiscriminate as its life had been. The final moment came when Prince Demon, standing in the center of the collapsing ritual, made his choice. He could feel the curse trying to find a new host, seeking to perpetuate itself through him. But he had carried the pain of thousands, and that accumulated suffering had given him a strength his family never possessed, the strength to say no. As his father and mother dissolved into their component horrors, as his siblings were unmade by their own power, Demon spoke the words of unbinding that Marcus had discovered. The words were simple, almost anticlimactic. We were wrong. We are sorry. Let it end. But spoken by one who bore the curse willingly taking responsibility, they had the power to break chains forged by nearly a century of atrocity. The explosion, if it could be called that, was not of fire or force but of revelation. Every illusion shattered. Every justification crumbled. Every person in the empire suddenly saw clearly what they had become, what they had allowed, what they had done. The false histories were burned from their minds, replaced by truth. The propaganda that had made cruelty seem necessary evaporated like morning mist. Citizens who had participated in atrocities with enthusiasm found themselves fully aware of their actions, stripped of the comfortable lies that had made them possible. The screaming that followed wasn't from physical pain but from the agony of awakening to one's own monstrosity. When the dawn came, the palace of echoing screams was gone. In its place stood ruins that looked ancient, as if centuries had passed in a single night. Of the royal family, only Prince Demon remained, aged beyond his years, his hair white as bone. The curse in his blood had burned itself out, leaving him merely human, but a human who remembered everything. The Void Child had vanished, taking with it chunks of reality that would never quite heal. The empire that had terrorized half the world for nearly a century collapsed in a single day, not through conquest but through the simple inability of its citizens to look at each other without seeing reflected the horrors they had all enabled. The morning after the dynasty's fall revealed an empire transformed into a charnel house of the spirit. In every city, town and village, citizens wandered the streets like sleepwalkers awakening from a nightmare to find blood on their hands. The capital, once home to 3 million souls, saw half its population flee within the first week, unable to bear remaining in places where they had committed or witnessed unspeakable acts. The other half couldn't leave, paralyzed by guilt, by the need to atone, or simply by the crushing weight of remembering what they had done with such enthusiasm just days before. The immediate chaos was overwhelming. Without the dark magic that had maintained order through fear, society collapsed into something worse than anarchy, a collective nervous breakdown. In the merchant quarter, Erasmus Crane, who had built his fortune selling torture devices, was found in his showroom, methodically destroying every piece with his bare hands, his fingers worn to bone, weeping as he recited the names of everyone he knew his devices had harmed. The gilded instruments he had once displayed with pride became monuments to shame. His wife discovered him 3 days later, dead from exhaustion, surrounded by twisted metal and his own blood, a note reading simply, "I remembered their screams." The Temple of the Bleeding Sun became ground zero for a different kind of horror, the horror of recognition. High Priest Matthias, who had rewritten holy texts to justify atrocity, stood before his congregation and began confessing. For 18 hours straight, he detailed every corruption, every twisted interpretation, every life sacrificed on altars he had sanctified. His priests tried to stop him, but he continued until his voice gave out, then wrote in blood on the temple walls when he could no longer speak. By the end, half his congregation had fled, unable to bear the weight of their complicity. The other half remained, some seeking absolution, others simply too broken to move. 7 priests took their own lives that first night, unable to reconcile who they had become with who they had once believed themselves to be. The discovery of evidence began immediately, and what emerged defied comprehension. In the ruins of the Palace of Echoing Screams, investigators found rooms they couldn't explain, chambers where time moved differently, where the walls recorded everything that had happened within them. Playing back these recordings was mandatory for the tribunals that followed, but the investigators paid a heavy price. Many couldn't sleep afterward, haunted by visions of tortures they had witnessed across temporal echoes. Chief Investigator Helena Voss, tasked with cataloging the evidence, lasted 3 months before the accumulated horror broke her. Her final report, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, ended with, "We must remember everything. We must forget nothing. But God help us, how do we live with knowing?" The first trials were not of the dynasty members. Most were dead or transformed beyond judgment, but of the collaborators, which meant nearly everyone. How do you try an entire civilization? The Tribune of Truth, hastily assembled from the few judges who had retained some integrity, faced an impossible task. They established categories of guilt: active perpetrators, willing enablers, passive participants, and coerced victims. But the lines blurred constantly. A woman who had tortured her neighbors might reveal she had done so to prevent her children from being taken for sacrifice. A man who had served as an executioner had been forced to kill his own brother first to prove his loyalty. Everyone was both victim and victimizer, caught in a web of complicity that the dynasty had woven with terrible skill. The executions that followed were unlike any in history. The active perpetrators, those who had risen highest in the hierarchy of horror, faced justice that tried to balance accountability with the recognition that revenge would only perpetuate the cycle. Lord Blackwood, creator of the loyalty trials, was sentenced to experience every pain he had inflicted, compressed into a single moment through recovered dark magic. He aged 50 years in that instant, his hair turning white, his body breaking, but he survived, barely. His sentence was to live, to remember, and to speak. He spent his remaining years traveling from town to town, telling his story, bearing witness to his own monstrosity as a warning to others. Many couldn't bear to listen. Some tried to kill him. He accepted both reactions as just. The survivors of the dynasty's direct cruelty faced a different challenge. Those who had been kept in the bleeding rooms, drained regularly for their blood, were freed to find their families had often been the ones selling them. Children who had been raised as sacrifices discovered their parents had conceived them specifically for death. Victims of the memory thieves wandered the streets, unable to remember their own names, while their stolen memories were found crystallized in noble houses, kept as curiosities. The process of reuniting people with their memories proved dangerous. Many couldn't handle the return of what had been taken, the joy now poisoned by knowledge of what came after. Support groups formed, then dissolved as members couldn't bear to face others who reflected their own damage. The children presented the most heartbreaking challenge. An entire generation had grown up knowing only the dynasty's reality. They had played games of torture, celebrated birthdays with blood, learned to read from books written on human skin. The re-education efforts were massive and often failed. Child psychologist Dr. Marcus Rain documented hundreds of cases of children who couldn't understand why causing pain was suddenly wrong. But mother said screaming means love, one 6-year-old told him, genuinely confused why she was being punished for hurting her playmates. The schools established to help these children often became places of secondary trauma, as teachers struggled to undo years of institutionalized sadism while dealing with their own guilt over what they had taught before. Prince Demon, the only surviving member of the royal bloodline, became a figure of intense controversy. Some wanted him executed for his family's crimes. Others saw him as a hero who had sacrificed everything to end the curse. He refused both narratives. Instead, he submitted himself to the tribune, insisting on a full accounting of every crime his bloodline had committed. For months, he sat in the witness chair, using his inherited memories to detail atrocities that might otherwise have been forgotten. He aged visibly with each testimony, the weight of confession adding years to his face. When asked why he insisted on this self-torture, he replied, "Someone must remember. Someone must carry it all. Let it be me, let it end with me." The economic aftermath was catastrophic. Industries built on suffering collapsed overnight. The pain merchants found their stored anguish had become poison, killing anyone who touched it. The currency backed by distilled agony became worthless, leaving many destitute. Trade routes that had carried instruments of torture and victims for sacrifice had to be reimagined. Some cities, too tainted by their participation, were abandoned entirely. Valdris, the city of nightmares, remained empty for a generation, its buildings slowly reclaimed by nature that seemed to grow strangely, flowers that bloomed only at night, trees that wept red sap, grass that whispered names of the dead. The international response was swift and merciless. Neighboring kingdoms that had lived in fear of the Aurelian Empire for decades invaded not for conquest but for justice. They found a population too broken to resist. War crimes tribunals were established, but they faced the same problem as the internal courts: how to judge a society where crime had been law. Some kingdoms advocated for total annihilation, arguing that the taint was too deep to cleanse. Others pushed for rehabilitation, believing that those who had lived through such systematic evil could become the strongest voices against its return. The debates raged for years with no clear resolution. Documentation became an obsession for the survivors. Libraries were built specifically to house records of the dynasty's crimes. Artists who had created beauty from suffering now worked to preserve the ugliness of truth. The blood canvases were not destroyed but displayed with full context: who had died for each piece, how they had suffered, why the artist had thought it beautiful. Museums of remembrance sprouted across the former empire, each one a testament to how low humanity could sink when it convinced itself that cruelty was strength. Visiting these museums became a form of pilgrimage, a way for citizens to confront what they had allowed, what they had become. The physical remnants of the curse lingered long after the dynasty's fall. Places where great suffering had occurred developed supernatural properties. The ground where mass executions had taken place remained barren, rejecting all attempts at cultivation. Buildings used for torture would suddenly echo with screams on the anniversary of particularly horrific events. Children born in the immediate aftermath sometimes carried marks of the curse, not the full corruption of the bloodline but smaller taints. A child might be born with eyes that saw only in shades of red, or with the ability to sense pain in others with unbearable clarity. These, curse-touched, became reminders that some sins left scars across generations. As the first year ended, the empire that had terrorized half the world existed only in memory and ruin. But those memories proved harder to kill than any dynasty. Survivors formed communities based not on shared triumph but shared shame. They developed rituals of remembrance, gathering monthly to speak names of victims, to confess participation, to ensure that forgetting would be impossible. These gatherings were agony, reliving horrors, facing those you had wronged, accepting condemnation from those you had harmed. But they were also necessary. As one survivor wrote, "We build our new world on the bones of the old. We must know every bone, every break, every scream that made them. Only then can we ensure we never build such a thing again." 3 centuries have passed since the fall of the Aurelian dynasty, yet its shadow stretches across time like a scar that refuses to fade. In the great libraries of New Valdris, built upon the ruins of the City of Nightmares, scholars study the period not as distant history but as an ever-present warning. The Curse Codex, as historians now call the collected documentation of the dynasty's rule, fills 17,000 volumes. Every year new evidence emerges: mass graves uncovered by construction, hidden chambers filled with artifacts of horror, diary entries from victims thought lost forever. Each discovery forces modern society to confront an uncomfortable truth: the capacity for such evil lies dormant in every civilization, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. The archaeological excavations of the last decade have revealed horrors that even contemporary accounts couldn't capture. Dr. Elena Marchetti's team, working in what was once the Palace of Echoing Screams, discovered the temporal chambers, rooms where Aldrich had trapped victims in looping moments of agony. The chambers still function 300 years later. The team watched in horror as ghostly figures appeared, experiencing their deaths over and over, unable to escape even in death. The ethical debate over whether to destroy the chambers or preserve them as evidence raged for months. In the end, they were sealed but not destroyed, with monitoring equipment to ensure the trapped souls were not forgotten, their eternal suffering a reminder of what unchecked power could achieve. Modern genetic research has revealed the true extent of the bloodline curse's reach. Dr. Rashid Patel's groundbreaking study traced genetic markers across continents, finding that nearly 1 in 7 people in the former empire carry some trace of Aurelian blood. Most show no symptoms, but certain triggers, extreme stress, proximity to sites of historical atrocity, exposure to specific symbols from the dynasty, can activate dormant traits. Support groups exist for the blood carriers, people who struggle with intrusive thoughts of violence, who dream in languages they don't recognize, who sometimes see through eyes that aren't their own. The condition, formerly known as hereditary trauma syndrome, has forced society to grapple with questions of inherited guilt and genetic responsibility. The political implications continue to resonate. The Valdres Accords, signed 50 years after the dynasty's fall, established international laws against blood magic, hereditary punishment, and systematic cruelty. Yet these laws are tested constantly. 20 years ago, the nation of Carathia nearly fell to the Sons of Shadow, a cult that claimed direct descent from Prince Aldrich and sought to restore the dynasty. They had rediscovered several minor rituals, enough to grant them influence over weak minds. It took a coalition of 5 nations to stop them, and the battle revealed how fragile the barriers against such evil remained. The cult's leaders, when captured, showed physical signs of transformation: extended fingers, eyes that reflected light like a cat's, shadows that didn't quite match their movements. They were executed, but not before they prophesied that others would follow, that the hunger for such power could never be truly extinguished. In schools across the former empire, the Aurelian period is mandatory study, but teaching it presents unique challenges. Professor Maria Santos, who developed the current curriculum, discovered that traditional historical approaches failed. Students would either dismiss the horrors as exaggerated or become so overwhelmed they couldn't process the lessons. The solution was innovative, immersive education using carefully controlled magical recreations. Students experience, in diluted form, what it felt like to live under the dynasty. They feel the pressure to conform, the slow normalization of cruelty, the seductive promise of power through causing pain. The program has been controversial but effective. As one student wrote, "I understood how it happened when I felt myself starting to enjoy the power. That's when I truly learned to fear what humans can become." The discovery of the hidden archives 5 years ago sent shockwaves through academic circles. Deep beneath the old Imperial Academy, sealed chambers contained the complete research notes of the architects of suffering. The ethical debate over what to do with this knowledge split the scholarly community. The documents contained detailed instructions for rituals that could grant tremendous power at horrific cost. Some argued for complete destruction. Others insisted that understanding evil required studying it fully. The compromise satisfied no one. The most dangerous knowledge was magically sealed, viewable only by a council of ethicists, historians, and survivors' descendants. But black market copies circulate, and every year, authorities uncover plots by those who believe they can control what destroyed the Aurelians. Modern literature and art struggle with representing the period. The banned works list includes 1,700 pieces created during the dynasty, not destroyed but restricted to scholarly access. Yet artists continue to be drawn to the period's dark magnetism. The playwright Lucian Gray's Children of Shadow caused riots during its premiere, its realistic portrayal of how ordinary people became monsters proving too much for audiences. The visual artist Keiko Tanaka's exhibition, Inherited Sins, featured portraits of modern people painted in the style of blood canvases, asking viewers to consider what horrors they might be capable of. The exhibition was closed after 3 days when visitors reported experiencing physical pain while viewing the works, a phenomenon investigators couldn't explain. The medical community has documented what they call Aurelian syndrome, a cluster of symptoms appearing in people with no genetic connection to the bloodline but who spend significant time studying the period. Symptoms include nightmares in ancient languages, compulsive documentation of others' pain, and in severe cases, physical transformation. Dr. Yuki Yamamoto, who spent 7 years cataloging torture devices, developed scales on her forearms and an inability to digest anything but raw meat. She recovered after intensive treatment but warns other researchers about the dangers of prolonged exposure to the dynasty's artifacts. Evil of that magnitude leaves traces, she writes. It wants to propagate, to spread, to find new hosts. We must study it, but we must never forget that it studies us back. The economic lessons from the period have shaped modern financial systems. The suffering markets of the Aurelian era demonstrated how any aspect of human experience could be commodified if society allowed it. Today's banking regulations include specific provisions against experience trading, born from the horror of the pain merchants. Yet underground markets persist. Last year, authorities in New Carthage broke up a ring selling bottled trauma to addicts who had become dependent on consuming others' pain. The dealers used modified Aurelian techniques, proving that the old knowledge never truly dies, merely hibernates until greed or desperation awakens it. Religious movements born from the dynasty's fall continue to shape spiritual thought. The Church of Broken Chains, founded by survivors, preaches that every human carries the potential for both transcendent good and unspeakable evil. Their central ritual involves members confessing not their actions but their darkest impulses, acknowledging what they might be capable of under the right circumstances. The witnesses of memory maintain vast archives of survivor testimonies, believing that forgetting any detail dishonors the victims. The Order of Silent Princes, claiming descent from Prince Demon, practice extreme asceticism, believing that denying themselves all pleasure somehow atones for their ancestors' sins. Technology has revealed new horrors from the past while creating new ethical dilemmas. Advanced scanning techniques can now detect curse residue in objects, leading to the identification of thousands of previously unknown artifacts. The question of what to do with these objects, destroy them, study them, or use them to understand the period better, divides experts. More troubling are the virtual reality reconstructions that allow people to experience historical events firsthand. The most sophisticated programs can simulate the mental state of both perpetrators and victims. While valuable for education, they've also attracted those who seek to experience cruelty without consequence. 3 cases of virtual possession have been documented, where users became so immersed in the historical figures' perspectives that they required magical intervention to separate their identities. The warning signs identified by modern scholars read like a checklist of contemporary concerns: the normalization of cruelty through entertainment, the concentration of power in charismatic leaders who claim divine mandate, the gradual erosion of empathy through systematic dehumanization, the transformation of justice into spectacle, the commodification of human suffering. Professor Chin Wei's seminal work, The Aurelian Mirror, forces readers to examine current society through the lens of the dynasty's rise. Her parallels between modern social media mob justice and the loyalty trials, between reality television and the reality performances, between genetic engineering and bloodline cultivation, have sparked fierce debate and soul-searching. As this chronicle ends, one truth remains inescapable: the Aurelian dynasty was not an aberration but an amplification of human potential for evil. Every society carries within it the seeds of such horror, requiring constant vigilance to prevent their germination. The cursed bloodline may have died with Prince Demon, but the human capacity for transforming love into obsession, power into cruelty, justice into vengeance, remains eternal. In the Museum of Dark Reflections, the final exhibit is not an artifact but a mirror, surrounded by a simple inscription: "The monsters of history wore human faces." When you look at yours, what do you see? The number of visitors who flee that room without looking continues to grow each year, perhaps the most honest testament to the Aurelian legacy. Not the evil they did, but the evil they revealed lies sleeping in us all.